In the Darkness I See by Anon Chapter 4 Meditations on Art Part 3 The next session was in no small way a success. Tommy began the session's conversation with an unfamiliar glow punctuating his proclamations. His demeanor, slightly stained with an aura of irreverence, seemed too facile. "Explain your glee to me," I demanded. Like some great orator, he handed me his haiku and recited it. Serendipity, serenity in morning. Of these things I know. I heard his poem and struck a pensive pose. He followed suit. The poem, simple yet extravagant, examined life so plainly, but with such intense accuracy. I thought to myself with disturbing lucidity, and then took a quick note. From early to late life, I noted, the poem explores the major moments. The serendipity of life as a willing youth leads to certain uncertainty that seems to always envelop and develop its pyrogenic progeny. The sanguine entropy of youth, so well encapsulated, gloriously gleams within the chambers of the first line. The homophones within the second line, morning or morning, create a lovely and complex ponderance within the poem. The duality in meaning, when verbally presented, unyielding in pragmatic presentation, is stunning. Perhaps the haiku highlights the calmness within the crevice of morning, that time away from the travesties of life, a quiet and pensive time, the moment dedicated to the endogenous plights and quandaries of man. Maybe he calls before my mind the latter homophone. He must then be referring to the realness and abundant undeniable purity of grief that only calls upon those who have loved and lost. His locution longed to describe this, perhaps. Both versions signal an important feature within the main stage of life. Simultaneously, the insecurity of the homophones emphasizes the eternally unpredictable nature of life. The lost line, so beautiful, reaches out and grips the final experience of life, a reflective and fulfilling time. It bellows out into my heart. Oh, the things I shall know. After Tommy's entrancing poetic spell had faded, I reorganized my thoughts into a singular question, asking, "How did you come to create such a lovely piece?" He smiled and thanked me. With little thought, he examined his processing and responded, saying, "I've spent my life quarreling with good and evil. I used each moment of my life to convince others of my value through virtue. We all spend life convincing ourselves and others who we are and what we believe. All this groveling is wasted on us anyway. We all know the inherent truths that fortify our wakeful delusions, deep within our bones. Perhaps this is why stillness frightens us. We are simply too well acquainted with ourselves, and realize it in those moments. A longing for morality has been so stained now, with emptiness as its sole follower, that it can never be satiated. I cannot live in the shadow of my life nor our truth any more. I wish to be one with the world, brimming with potential, neither good nor bad." Tommy abruptly raised his voice, completely impassioned. "I wish to smell a rose and deem it a flower. I lust for a love to engross me, and for me to label it a passion. I wait for my time to act and call it action. With the simplicity of thought gifted to those at peace, I want only to understand and accept the world as it is. This poem encapsulates my search. It calls forth the simplicity of our journey through life. From the deepest and realest part of us, little remains of the poetic pollution usually imbued within the greatest pieces of art. Only the truth remains, the skeletal simplicity of life. It's all there." I thanked him for his answer, and inherently understood it without further questioning. We sat in mutual agreement of the poem's power. He was an incredible poet. Of that I was certain. Within that moment of quiet wonder, I caught him acknowledging me being very impressed with him. It was too obvious to verbally hide my pride in knowing the young man, and so we remained silent for some time while I navigated the best path forward for his mental well-being. I knew that in admitting to the poem's brilliance, I would only serve to bolster the young man's already inflated perception of his merits and thus denigrate his striving for a better future. So, I remained positioned to aid in my client's growth. I applauded his attempt and asked him to explain the personal significance of the poem. "It describes my life," he said, "well lived and dynamic, though troubling in simplicity." Unbelievably, the boy had felt he had lived a full life, 1/5 the way through his journey, and Tommy was done. He had been through the unjustifiable unsteadiness, the calmness, the love, and the loss. He knew of it all. Perhaps he felt as though it was his time for obliteration back into the unconsciousness of oblivion, to join his father in the settled security of some distant and unfeeling nebula. He felt beaten, yet accomplished, a trademark of maturity. His youthful appearance and energy, opposed by his tormented spirit, troubled me deeply. The rest of the session was spent debating on the necessity of being, while I formulated a counterclaim to the presumed postulate he had unearthed. Finally, we landed on a significant substructural component to reinvigorate his life. Tommy discussed his uniquely realized existentialism as being the most real and vibrant part of his life's meaning. It gave him joy to know that he was the beneficiary of a self-defined structure, and that the losses and realities that struck him with such austerity held meaning. The magnetism of man towards power, to truth, and into morality are all roused by hardships, explained Tommy. Only through the tormenting of a man may he discover what truly lies beneath. It is from the most fathomless depths of suffering that I have climbed to the most unfathomable heights of self-realization. The value of structure and a well-built life lies within the knowledge of its opposition. The understanding of the most severe disorder and chaos in a life not lived in a manner befitting a man of value is the very thing that necessitates movement towards goals and acquisition of those goals. This is where Scripture becomes valuable. Through ritualistically reinforced lessons and stories, the hardship of evil and the virtue of its antithesis are displayed and examined, allowing followers to embody the prevailing truth. Sacred text is vicarious wisdom. That understanding was a troubling delight to hear coming from Tommy. While it gave me hope for his future, in that he understood the basic principles outlined by the philosophical thinkers that developed the framework to which he admitted himself, it baffled me as to why he was still such an unsteady and nihilistic individual. He understood humanity at a level most petrifying to unveil, but he found no virtue in truth whilst claiming it to be the pinnacle of greatness. He needed more guidance, but the movement forward seemed more treacherous than ever. I knew that, for every incorrect theory or structure, a large computational system such as that intellectual whippet's mind needed not to fret with initial inaccuracies. Even from false premises, his systematically grand mind was to anyway fortify the faulty initial structures with immense rationalizations and dynamic justifications. The magnificent mind of Tommy could have been already too easily been misled into many theories that expelled inaccuracy. The powerful dissemination of those mixture groupings, his bag of productive and cancerous ideas, called upon all of his intellectual prowess, and thus the theories were, with great resolution, growing and morphing before my eyes and breath into a working moral composition. Though as inaccurate as any others, said thoughtful composition was being effectively used and tested, powerfully and compellingly, through colorful ideations and seemingly intrinsic extrapolations of discourse-like explosions. The initial constructs faded into the background, and new perceptual frameworks dominated him over and over again. His brilliant mind increasingly called for ultra-careful counsel. I buzzed with anticipation, ready to release him from his unthoughtful descent into moral subjectivity. Even while Kierkegaard and Marcel starkly opposed rigid religiosity, they dignified themselves with at least a moral possibility, allowing for some semblance of order without the confinement of a defined morality. I thought it interesting that Tommy hadn't done the same. When I asked about his potential misalignment, he took a moment for some internal dialogue. It is from the efficacious reality of existentialism that I draw my critique, he said calmly. The simplicity of the goal-driven framework leads back to simple mammalian biology. The deep enrichment of our lives that is perpetually driven by the next dopaminergic exercise calls me immediately to the thought of a mouse pulling a lever. This connection to such a simple creature insults my humanity. The philosophers, with all their honor of formulating this initial moral form, had no way of understanding the complexities of neuroscience. If they had, I am sure they would have also felt as though the theory's practicality is opposed to divinity because of its simple endocrinological manipulation. Newer age additions and addendums help, but I cannot help but to feel that we are jamming tacks into a space balloon. Tommy's thought seemed to be such a juvenile formulation. All those painstakingly combed through theorizations about the intricate depths of truth and understanding seemed more than ever to be nothing more than flagrant pontifications to ensure that I knew he was a capable adversary. And this seeming was especially not true. The clear lack of self-value within Tommy screamed at me. He had to be more than just biology. However, simultaneously, it all had to be worth more than just him to endure his life. With those thoughts floating through my mind, I continued plainly, adding, "Existentialism cannot satiate your thirst for transcendence from your biology. Divinity is the only route to elevation. Regardless, I must ask this of you. Is it that you must surpass biology to derive meaningful structure and joy, or is it rather that there are major biological parts of your life that are not being fulfilled? Busying yourself with thought will not solve your needs. Once fulfilled, these biological truths will bear positive fruits, and it will become clear that there is only purpose in everything." From that truthful condemnation, he distanced himself. He knew that any immediacy of creative counter-acknowledgement would call for a direct admission of lower status in the game he was so brutishly playing. And so, with predictably little haste, Tommy contemplated my absurdly destructive opposition. The busyness displayed so purposefully upon his face drove me to pull back a ridiculous grin, one that he had earned rather than me, with all my insecurity aroused. I realized that for one to relish any act of victorious conquest, the opponent had to be of a stature approximating that of the ephemeral conqueror. Hence, the intellect of Tommy had clearly enamored me enough to earn my regards to equitably view him as an opponent. That equity was a rather large feat for such a young man. It was so impressive, in fact, that it filled me with a sense of urgent dismay. The comparison between him and I in timely study, involuted experience, and in-depth discourse was clear. However, the conversational therapy that his treatment had become had the tempo and characteristics of a conversation between a pair of peers in even dialogue. After some time to think, he stood up and looked upon me as if I were his subject. He patiently prepared his rebuttal. Though it is true that the depth of meaning could come from the self if well identified and easily distracted, he stated superciliously as he paced back and forth in his small little area of my office, we must remember that any person's life, no matter how well ordered or simple, is filled with the inexpediency of suffering. Whether deep or shallow, the suffering is constant and unrelenting. It is never an abstruse task to recall the suffering that anchors one to reality. This endured suffering must be fecundated through any moral lens to give it righteous purposefulness. Otherwise, the suffering, and more crucially, the person whose experience from which the suffering blossoms, is deemed pointless. It is with emphatic expedience that we must find the reason for the suffering, as this is much more abundant than the calmness between calamities. Growing ill-mannered from Tommy's robust contrarianism, I identified the thematic essence of his claims and began decompartmentalizing his bountiful assertions. From that seemingly ethereal set of suppositions, the truth seemed to peer through me too clearly. Tired of allowing him to talk circles around his real problems, and synchronously growing weary of his challenging spirit and tenacity, I hastened to quell him with a lengthy pronouncement. "You spend so much of your precious time delegitimizing the chasing of mammalian sensation," I said vibrantly, "not because it is unimportant or insignificant in building any certain grandeur within your life. Rather, perhaps it is because the realization that these pivotal instincts, desires, and emotions are essential, and that you have mostly failed in satiating them, would crush you into an even smaller man. Furthermore, rather than trying to confront the sources of anger and frustration that are dredging their way through your life, you attempt to posture yourself amongst intellectuals and derive meaning from this fruitless act. It is this process that has led you so sheepishly to where you are today." We sat for another long while after that exchange. And then, in an abrupt change of pace, he rejoicingly lunged into a new era of strength for him, musical theory. Tommy had developed a new piece of sitar music. He continued in line with his earlier musical appreciation by showing me a rather short recording of the song's chorus. The intricate plucking was only eclipsed by the rich, story-like note progression. He told me that he had only started playing the sitar a couple of months prior to the recording of such a transcendently lovely song. Once again, overly impressed, I clumsily responded with some appropriate gratifications. To express my actual concern, envy, or wonder would have been impossible. A truly grand life force shared the room with me. The piece was so earthly and instinctual. Ingrained in the simple melody was the deeply honest and almost personified by sound profusion of sadness that coded Tommy as an entrance into humanity. The skillful resemblance to life that piece contained within its musical matrix was on par with some of the greatest symphonies. I wondered how the young man could have been so talented, so plainly above average in all pursuits, but simultaneously deflated and insecure. To that end, I silently recalled an ingeminated quotation that had been first instilled within me by my father at his insightful end. I did not share it with Tommy, but somehow he knew and recapitulated the truth of my father's message. "It is of only the most extravagantly organized minds," Tommy's faint voice whispered, "to allow asinine fixations to become dilemmas of interminability. Trivial losses become losses of allegoric proportion. Unidimensional realities become the most entangled fixtures of contorted moralities. Love, happiness, and transcendence in the moment, instantaneous glory within the infinite now, are barely considered germane to the instant itself. This describes the best of men." His face suddenly glowed with irreverent frustration, growing uncontainable. "It is those men who push into the unknown and shine light on the undiscovered. It has to be. It just has to be." That was Tommy. His inescapable mind sub-true totally weaving a net that entrapped even the strongest spirits of his joy. The darkness within him had morphed him into some unholy vagabond. A cannibalistic conquistador had been born from the inferno of Tommy's broken heart and mind. It was the saddest thing I had ever seen. This has been Chapter 4, Part 3 of In the Darkness I See by Anon Y.